Okay, before we get into game, there's a few things we need to take a look at. We're going to be talking about your computer, your monitor, peripherals like your keyboard, your mouse, your Wi-Fi, and also your graphics settings and monitor settings on your computer that could affect your performance. So you don't need any of this stuff in order to be able to play League well, but you have to understand the kind of cost and benefit of getting these things and whether it's worth it to you or not. So when it comes to your keyboard, it's going to be pretty much personal preference, but I'm going to recommend that with the mouse and the keyboard that you're going to get a wired connection so that it doesn't end up dying on you while you're playing. That's important, and it seems to me that those are more responsive as well from what people have said. When it comes to the mouse, you're going to focus on two numbers that are important for the quality of the mouse, and you're also going to get something that personally to you feels good to use and you feel like you can use accurately. The two numbers are the polling rate, and the polling rate is how many times per second the sensor on the mouse feeds information to the computer. And so obviously the higher the polling rate, the more accurate your mouse movement is going to feel to the way you're actually moving your mouse. And so you're going to want to find a mouse. I think the one I'm using is 1,000, the polling rate. I don't know if there's anything available that's higher than that, but you're going to want to try to find a mouse with a higher polling rate. Now, out of all of these things, the mouse is probably one of the most important things, and it's probably the cheapest piece that you're going to pick up for the setup. And so I would make sure that you have a good mouse. That being said, there are a lot of good mice that are not name brand that are relatively cheap. But if you, again, pay attention for a good cheap mouse that's not necessarily name brand, or it could be, but has a high polling rate, and then the other number, which we'll talk about, is DPI, or SteelSeries is calling it CPI now. DPI and CPI is like mouse sensitivity and how high it can go. And the higher it can go, the better, because this DPI on the mouse, it being higher and your sensitivity on the computer or in game being lower, is better than having, and more accurate to the way you're moving your mouse, than having a high sensitivity in game and a low DPI. So for example, on this mouse that I'm using right now, I have 18,000 DPI or CPI, which is quite high. And then I just have a lower sensitivity in game. And obviously it would be nice, lots of even cheap mice have some software that come with them that you can download from their website so that you can make sure that you know what CPI you're playing at, so that you know that your polling rate is set up so that it's as high as it can be, so that you're actually utilizing these things rather than just buying a mouse that has the potential to do it, right? Next, we're going to talk about the monitor. When it comes to the monitor, you have really one important thing, which is its refresh rate, and that's going to impact how recent you see frames from the game. And that's important because the lower your refresh rate, the less often you're seeing information about the game than somebody else, and that could lead to a disadvantage. And people have noticed, and I noticed when I moved from a 60 hertz monitor to 144, that there was a big difference in how fast it felt like the game was being played, and it felt more responsive. And maybe that's part placebo, but and more higher quality monitors can be very expensive, so you have to make the decision whether you want to do it or not. But it does seem like having a higher refresh rate on your monitor is definitely worth it. And then this is something you don't want to run into. Once you have a monitor that's a higher refresh rate, or if you already have one, you want to right click your desktop when you get the monitor and plug it in, and go to display settings, and then go to advanced display settings, and then check that your refresh rate down here is actually set to the refresh rate of your monitor, because you could very easily have a 100, I probably should not have done that. You could very easily have a 144 hertz monitor and be running it on a 60 refresh rate, and that would be terrible because you paid for this nice monitor and you don't have it set up to actually display that many frames per second, and maybe the only difference you're noticing at all is completely placebo. Right. So then the next thing would be your computer, and the only piece of your computer that really, really matters is your graphics card, your GPU. And again, graphics cards are very expensive, but the higher FPS you can get, the better. So why does that make sense? We just talked about how the monitor can only display, depending on the monitor you have, 60 FPS or 144, and they make ones that are higher than that as well. So what's the point of being able to have more than 144 FPS on a monitor that can only display 144 frames per second? And there's actually a good reason why you want more than 144 frames per second. What happens is your monitor, if you have a 144 hertz monitor, will look for 144 frames every second to display to you. But if you're producing 300 frames a second, the frame that it'll choose from will on average be more likely to be more recent than if you were only producing a frame every 144th, 1 144ths of a second. So you want to have as high of FPS as possible, because the frames that your monitor will actually drag and select will be more recent, and it'll give you less input lag. It'll feel like you're seeing more recent events, that kind of thing. And so that's really important as well. So to make sure that we have the highest possible FPS, we're going to maximize our in-game settings. But aside from that, we're also going to maximize our NVIDIA control panel settings. And if you have a different graphics card, you should look up a video on how to do that for those settings. And the reason why I want to talk about these settings in the first place, rather than just direct you to other videos, is to make it clear that what we want is performance and not quality. I've seen other videos when trying to research what these settings do myself that say that they're telling you what the performance settings are, but then they'll go and they'll show pictures of what it looks like one versus the other, and then they'll select settings because it looks better. So they're not really aiming for maximum FPS and performance in order to have the best competitive edge that they can get. What they're actually just doing is going through and picking some settings. And I think it's disingenuous, because if you really want high performance, you should try to minimize all of your graphics, lower the visual quality, so that you get that more recent input, even if things are a little bit more pixelated, because the pixels aren't going to throw you off. You still have all the information that you need, whether this edge is smooth or not. But having that information a little bit earlier about how people moved and stuff like that is much more important. And so high-level players take the trade-off of having worse graphics, low settings in game, in order to be able to have the best performance. And so that's what I'm going for. If you want it to look the best, you should, leave your settings default or go look at a guide on quality. And even for my settings are trying to get the best performance, but I don't know exactly what all of these settings do. And so this is just my best guess at it. Most of these other videos are wrong or contradicting each other on settings all the time. So I would just take every video that you see on these settings with a grain of salt, read through them yourself like I'm going to read through them with you, and make your own best decision on what you think is going to maximize performance, or test them. But that would take too long, so I'm not doing that. When it comes to adjust image settings with preview, I've let the advanced, I've not letting the application decide. I'm using the advanced 3D image settings, and what that means is that we're going to come in here and customize all of our global settings. So you can let the application decide this is fine, because if you have the correct in-game settings, then this could work fine. But you're going to find out that if you do that, not all of these settings are available in game, and so you're going to have a lot of things on that you could turn off and things like that. If we just use this slider and slid it towards performance and had that set on, then you know, not every setting that NVIDIA has set up by default to lean towards performance is necessarily what's going to give you the better performance, right? So this is kind of one-sided as well. The most advanced option is to use your own 3D image settings and then to come in here and read through all of these settings and set them up the way that you want them. So then in this next one, you have to understand that you have global settings, in-game settings, and like program settings. And what all of these things mean is that you've got a set of visual settings inside of a game like League and all of your other games. And then you've got global NVIDIA settings on your graphics card. And these settings will override any setting that you set in-game. And so if you're going to set them at all, or even if they're set by default, right, this is why you might want to gear towards, for example, up here, just letting the application decide, because then it'll just default to your in-game settings. But again, if you do that, some options won't be available to turn on or off in game, so you won't be able to do it to its full potential. For some things, right, you don't want this one setting overriding the same way for every single game, because maybe it's a bad setting to have for Minecraft and it's a good setting to have for League. In which case you could set up program settings here and you could add a specific set of settings for only League, for example. And you could keep your global settings default or something like that. And then that would solve that issue. So you can have multiple sets of settings depending on the game. If you add program settings, global settings are going to override everything. So with that out of the way, right, we've got the first one, image scaling. This list box, oh, that's the whole thing. Hold on, gotta hover over here. This feature enables GPU scaling and sharpening for your application. So what this means, image scaling, is that rather than rendering the image at your monitor's native resolution, you know, it's going to do bigger or smaller and it's going to scale it in some way. And we don't want our image to be scaled, so we're turning that off. Ambient occlusion adds realism to scenes by reducing the intensity of ambient light on surfaces blocked by surrounding objects. It enhances depth perception by providing a soft shadow effect for objects based on their placement in the scene. This feature is not supported for all applications. Refer to program settings to view per application support. NVIDIA's screen space ambient occlusion algorithm is not compatible with DX12 games. So this is what I'm talking about here. Ambient occlusion is something that there is no setting for in League of Legends, but is this shadow effect that you can tell your graphics card to not do, and it'll save you some FPS. It'll give you a little bit better performance. So we have that off. Anisotropic texture filtering affects the crispness of textures, but we don't need our textures to be crisp, so we've turned it off for performance. Anti-aliasing is a setting in League, so for example, you could have it off in League. If it's off here, it's just going to be overriding the off setting in League, so it's just going to be off either way. If you had this on in League and this off here, the off would override it being on in League. And you don't want to have this on in League. When you read the setting in League, what it basically says is that anti-aliasing sharpens edges and things like that on walls. It's again a small visual thing. It says FX anti-aliasing is a fast shader-based post-processing technique that can be applied to any program, including those which do not support other forms of hardware-based anti-aliasing. Can be used in conjunction with other anti-aliasing settings to improve overall image quality. But we don't want to improve image quality, we want to improve performance, so we've turned it off. Gamma correction is like a color correction that happens when anti-aliasing is occurring, but anti-aliasing is already turned off, so we can have this off and it won't matter. And then the mode, again, we have anti-aliasing off anyway, so this doesn't really matter, but we've just set this to application control, which is, I think, default. Anti-aliasing transparency allows you to minimize the visible aliasing on edges of images with transparent textures. We also have this off for performance. Background application max frame rate sets the maximum frame rate that the GPU, your graphics card, will render a game or 3D application running in the background. So we have this set to off. Basically what this would do is if you're playing League, it kind of sounds nice. It sounds like, oh, if I have Google Chrome open in the background, it's going to limit that application's the amount that it's processing that application, that the GPU is rendering that application, and focus that extra power on League or something like that. But this is only going to reduce the frame rate on games like League if it's in the background, because it says it's only setting a maximum frame rate on applications that your graphics card would be rendering, like a game or a 3D application that's running in the background. And obviously a lot of things like Google Chrome and Discord are probably not games or 3D applications, so I'm assuming it doesn't do anything to them. I recommend just closing all of your background applications when you're trying to play League in order to get maximum performance anyways, unless you have to have something like Discord open. CUDA GPUs allows you to specify which GPUs can be used by CUDA applications, including physics. And we just have, the one graphics card. So DSR factors. Dynamic super resolution. DSR produces smoother images by rendering a game at a higher resolution than downscaling it to the native resolution of the display. So we don't want scaling like we talked about earlier. We don't need to produce a higher quality image, and so we just have this off for performance. Low latency mode reduces the latency by limiting the number of frames the CPU can prepare before the frames are processed by the GPU. But we don't want to limit the number of frames that can be prepared at all, so we have this off. Max frame rate of any application, as we discussed earlier, we want to have unlimited. We want to have as high frame rate as possible so that our frames are giving us a more recent version of what's happening. And so even if our monitor has 144 as its refresh rate, for example, we want to have more frames than that. So we don't want to cap our max frame rate. I will say if you have a really good setup and you're actually getting 500, 600, 700 FPS, there seems to be a problem with League where if you're getting a super high amount of FPS, you actually start lagging from having too high FPS. It starts kind of teleporting you around a little bit. You kind of glitch around. It used to be that this problem was solved by turning off an in-game setting in League, which I'll talk about when I do the in-game settings in League video, but that no longer seems to be working. So at least even for me, before minions spawn, my frame rate is high enough that I'm kind of experiencing this issue where I'm jumping around all over the place, and then it goes away for me once the minions spawn because my frames drop so much. But for someone who is not having that problem, or you are having this max frame rate problem where it's too high, I would recommend investigating on your own any way to fix that problem of you jumping around. Contact Riot Support, do anything you can to fix that problem without capping your frame rate. And if you have to, go ahead and cap the frame rate, at like 500 FPS or as high as you can cap it at while still not having that issue occur. Because you want as much FPS as possible, and it's really too bad if you could get 700 or 800, but you cannot utilize that. Multi-frame sampled AA, MFAA, multi-frame sampled, believe this AA stands for anti-aliasing, works by reprogramming coverage sample locations across pixels within the same frame as well as across frames. This has the effect of making the overall sample pattern irregular, which eliminates aliasing artifacts. So again, we have anti-aliasing off. We shouldn't have anti-aliasing or aliasing artifacts, and we don't need it to get rid of those in any way that's going to reduce performance, so we have it off. OpenGL rendering GPU. select the GPU that'll be used by OpenGL applications. For me, I only have the one graphics card, so we've selected my graphics card. Power management mode. This feature allows you to set a preference for your graphics card's performance when running 3D applications, and we have it set to prefer maximum performance because we want performance, not quality. And then the preferred refresh rate is application controlled. So for some reason you needed to cap your FPS in a game, that would be up to the application rather than overriding it in the global settings. But in Game and League, we're going to have this set to unlimited. So in effect, we're going to have unlimited FPS, or as high as obviously you can handle. The shader cache size. This stores images and things like that from games and things like that. And it's kind of not necessary to store a ton. And so just to save space on your drive, you could limit this to 5 or 10. I think these other amounts are kind of ridiculous. So what it'll do is if you have it set to like 5 like I do, is once it gets above 5, it'll just delete and clear out the old images in there. Not that big of a deal. Texture filtering. Anisotropic sample optimization limits the number of anisotropic samples used based on texel size. This setting only affects DirectX programs. So I don't really know what that is, but to be honest, I think that we don't need texture filtering. It sounds like a visual improvement. Oh, but we do have this on. Oh, because it limits the number of anisotropic samples used. And that's why we have it on. Negative LOD bias. Some applications use negative LOD bias to sharpen texture filtering. This sharpens the stationary image, but introduces aliasing when the scene is in motion. And we have this clamped, so that's kind of like it's not doing it, or it's trying not to do it. Quality. The texture filtering quality, right, we have set to high performance. Texture filtering trilinear optimization. Trilinear optimization improves texture filtering performance by allowing bilinear filtering on textures in parts of the scene where trilinear filtering is not necessary. This setting only affects DirectX programs. So what we've done here is we've set it up so that, again, I don't know exactly what all of this means, and you should do your own research on these settings, but basically there are some things that need to be trilinear filtered, and if it's a simpler thing or whatever and it's not necessary, then it'll do it like a bilinear filtering or dual linear filtering. And that is, it says bilinear filtering. That's fine. So that it sounds like it'd be better to allow bilinear filtering sometimes instead of always forcing it to be trilinear. Threaded optimization allows applications to take advantage of multiple CPUs. Don't know that we have multiple CPUs, but that's set to whatever it is. Triple buffering allows you to enable or disable triple buffering for OpenGL applications. I believe when I read about the setting, triple buffering is like storing frames in advance, and we don't really want to do that because storing frames in advance is not necessarily producing the most recent image of what's happening, and so we don't want any of that, and so we've turned it off. Vertical sync attempts to match up when we're talking about the FPS and your monitor's hertz. This is attempting to make it so that when your monitor goes to grab that image, it tries to give it that image right at that time, but it doesn't work properly. NVIDIA G-Sync is kind of trying to do the same thing, and it's just better to have higher FPS than to ever have vertical sync on or to cap your FPS. Vertical sync essentially acts as a cap on your FPS as well. And it tries to be a better cap on your FPS by making sure it's producing the frames at the right time, but it's not as good as just having high FPS. And then this is for VR, if you have a VR headset. So this is just set to what it was by default. Let's see if there's any settings in here. This is asking for a processor. So I suppose you should select your GPU here, your graphics processor, instead of your CPU, because these kind of physics, visual settings and things like that. This is what your GPU, your graphics card was built for, not your CPU. So it'd be nice if that is what's processing it. You want to make sure here in change resolution that your refresh rate is also set to 144 and that your monitor's display is set to its native amount. It should be good. Your colors here are all personal preference. This is just the direction you have your screen. I think most of us are just going to be on landscape. That's fine. Nothing in here. Nothing in here. Under adjust desktop size and position, we want to make sure that no scaling is going on, and that if scaling were to be going on, we'd want it done on the GPU, because again, that's what the graphics card is there for, not your, your CPU shouldn't have to be doing this. And just probably put in, this is if scaling's happening again, so this is kind of off because we have no scaling, but you could make sure that your refresh rate and your monitor's resolution are correct. And then this is if you want to set up multiple displays, but we don't need to get into that. And so that should be good as far as the NVIDIA settings are concerned. And then as far as your internet, your internet's going to be important to playing League as well. And there's basically two things that go into how good your internet quality is when you're playing League, to keep things very simple. You've got your ping, and your ping is the, really it's more of a function of your distance from you to the server. So the server used to be located in California, now the server is located in Chicago. And so if you live really far away from Chicago, you're going to have higher ping by default, even if your internet's fine. And if you're closer to Chicago, you're going to have lower ping. Basically, you want to make sure that you have decent internet speeds. I think, the higher the better. It's going to be, there's two types of internet speeds. If you go to a site like speedtest.net or something like that, you have an upload speed and a download speed. And it's your download speed that you want to be high for gaming. Your upload speed would be for things like streaming yourself to the internet, uploading content yourself to the internet. So that doesn't really matter, and because it doesn't matter, it's quite low for a lot of people. Usually pretty standard internet, I would say, would be, you're getting about 30 download speed or higher. I get like 300 download speed. Maybe some people would say that 100 download speed is more standard, but most basic internet packages are going to be 30 download speed, 10 upload speed. And then as you progress, you get like 100 download speed and 10 upload speed. And then if you have something better, maybe 200 or 300 download speed and 10 upload speed or whatever. And these are fine. I'd say anything, 30 is a little bit low, but anything over 100 upload speed and you should be good. It depends on the number of devices and how many people are using the internet and things like that too. But you should be totally fine in most case scenarios with a reasonable number of people on the internet with 100 upload speed. So you don't need the best internet in the world. It's not going to make a huge difference, but obviously having decent internet is good. And then there are, of course, other issues you can run into with your internet. But if you find that you have that you have all the right settings outside of League, you have all the right settings in League, and you've got good upload and download speed, you've got normal ping for your area, then you might be having some other issues, and it could be your hardware, it could be your internet, and so keep those things in mind, that problems can occur there, and you want to make sure that that's not causing any problems. So that's it, and in the next one we're going to get into the in-game settings in League, and then we'll start really talking about the game.